Hello, if you're watching this at 5 a.m. BST when it inevitably will end up getting uploaded, cast your minds back to the previous 5 a.m. BST, or what time is it? 5:47 a.m. BST, when I'm filming it, and try and picture a witch. Picture whatever comes into your mind when I say the word witch. So you might imagine a warty old woman on a broomstick, or a woman that lures children into her home and eats them. Or you might be part of a modern witchcraft movement or a pagan movement. You might have a different idea entirely of what a witch is. Or you might not be an English speaker and you might have a completely different cultural idea of a witch. The word witche was an Anglo Saxon word, and the Anglo Saxons certainly had a concept of witchcraft and witches. So, what I want to do in this video is explore what that concept was and how the Anglo Saxons viewed witches, what they thought a witch was. The idea of a witch in the late Anglo-Saxon period definitely carried a stigma, at least in a church context, an ecclesiastical context. It was considered a bad thing to be. And another thing we can say about witches in the late Anglo-Saxon period is that they were probably real historical people. These were actual named people. These weren't spirits of the woodland. These weren't mysterious, unknown people that lived in the woods and stole children. They were real people. It aligns with the idea in a lot of European cultures, particularly in the 19th century and earlier, of cunning women, or sometimes cunning men, who were people who had a certain intuition, who might be able to divine the future, who might be associated with non-standard medical practices and things like that, who had a certain popular wisdom, a certain folk kind of wisdom that was not necessarily recognised as valid by the church. Those kinds of beliefs are still around to the present day in Cumbria, and I know in many other places in the UK as well, and I'm sure throughout Europe. Old English literature seems to see witchcraft as something not Christian, a practice that's mutually incompatible, mutually exclusive with Christianity, and therefore perhaps something devil-related, something diabolical. The law codes of Alfred the Great, which were written at the end of the 800s AD, contain a line advising people not to allow witches to live, but it doesn't really get much more specific than that. Magic and witchcraft, based on the idea of cunning women later on in the medieval, post-medieval period, magic and witchcraft in the Anglo-Saxon period might have had something to do with popular medicine, with sort of folk medicine that's not prescribed by the church, but it's the kind of medicine people did on a day-to-day basis when they got ill. And this included a lot of what we now call metrical charms. These charms often involved a combination of using particular plants, which is a common thing in biomedical systems, we still do that today, and saying certain words at certain specific points in the process in a particular way. So the words are part of the medicine. The medicine does not work without the words. If you miss the words, you've missed an active ingredient. And the charms weren't just solutions for what we'd now see as medical problems, but also for broader problems like fields not yielding good crop, keeping away elves and things which were seen as the cause of certain medical conditions. A lot of Anglo-Saxon communities kept bees, so there was a charm to stop bees from swarming and flying away, a charm to find your cattle if they'd gone missing, and things like that. And several of these charms were written down in corpuses like the Lochnagar, but what we have is probably only a very small fraction of what existed. A lot of features of these charms have the hallmarks of what you would expect of a Germanic pre-Christian religion. So they use the numbers 3 and 9 a lot, which we find in Scandinavian pre-Christian religion. And they also, one of them mentions an Anglo-Saxon god Warden. And Jackson Crawford has done a very good video on this charm, the 9 herbs charm, very recently, which I'll link in the description. I was going to do one myself, but he's said everything about it better than I could have done. So it might be that people in the church considered these charms to be pagan and therefore something to be discouraged, but clearly they were being practiced by communities long, long after the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons, just because the popular religion changes doesn't mean a culture's cosmology changes at the same time. So to use a possibly slightly flawed modern example, if a politician stood at a podium and said, all antibiotics are the work of Satan, don't use them, then people aren't going to stop using antibiotics, because antibiotics are integral to fighting bacterial infections as far as we're concerned. Somebody telling us these things are the work of the devil does not convince us that they're not effective, because they've always been effective for us in the past. It's part of our cosmology that this is how medicine works, you see what I mean? So a powerful or popular person standing up and saying this particular thing doesn't work would not have convinced the average person that it didn't work. Post-Christianization Anglo Saxons would not necessarily have seen on an individual, on a sort of rural popular level, they wouldn't necessarily have seen these practices as at odds with Christianity. They would have been, probably most of them, Christian, certainly later on. They wouldn't necessarily have seen any discrepancy between being Christian and still carrying out these metrical charms and things like that. You know, it's not necessarily that these people were secretly pagan and they secretly believed in Woden and things like that. They were Christian to the best of our understanding, but they probably just didn't see these charms as at odds with their Christianity. So the written versions of these charms we have may or may not be more Christianized than the versions that were practiced in real life. It's very, very hard to tell. And any intuition we might have comes from our own modern assumptions about the time, and it's not necessarily right. But is this the same thing as witchcraft? The idea of using a combination of plants and words to make things happen probably vaguely aligns with what a lot of English speakers consider a witch to be nowadays. But if everybody was doing it, if it was widespread enough to get written about, bearing in mind fewer people were able to read and write, to me it implies a lack of exclusivity. You know, the power is more in the plants and the words than the person, or if it is in the person, there are lots of people that have this ability, enough to warrant writing it down in text form. If a witch is a specific kind of person, and this kind of practice is presented as though anybody can do it, then they're not, you know, they're not the same thing, are they? Witchcraft is not the same thing as this popular medicine. You might argue that a witch is somebody who chooses to use this kind of influence to make bad things happen rather than good things. So to make fields infertile or to make cattle run away, the kinds of things that could really damage a community at that time. The law codes and ecclesiastical texts that mention witchcraft and diabolical sort of evil uses of charms tend to refer specifically to women. There are charm-like remedies which seem to be exclusive to women, so certain ones for easing childbirth. It seems like the woman has to speak those words herself. But that doesn't apply to all charms at all. There are many charms that it's stated explicitly that men can do. So it may be that there was a cultural difference where it was women that tended to deal with medicine, but there's evidence that the church's disapproval of these sort of medical practices was irrespective of gender, irrespective of the gender of the person carrying them out. An example of this is one of the homilies of the Anglo Saxon church, written by a man called Alfrich, who disapproved of the aspects of everyday life he considered to be heathen, said, "Neer skjolde we ordne hicht on latje wurtum besettan, ak on sån almichtian skipend, se som wurtum sånne kraftfull jauf. Neer shall non mon mit gaudre wurte besinjan, ak mit godes wurtum I jebletsion." Mon here could conceivably just mean person. You know, it's not specifically referencing men necessarily, but it's also not specifically referencing women. There's a strong sense, I'll put an interesting thesis in the description that goes into more detail about what metrical charms could be practiced by women, what could be practiced by men, things like that. But there's a strong sense that if there is a pre-Christian cultural remnant here, which I think there probably is, then both men and women are guilty of upholding it. It's easy for the mind to then jump to the idea that maybe the church was using this as a mechanism to devalue the role that women played in these kinds of things in communities. But on the other hand, I sometimes worry that that's too much applying a modern perspective, a modern political issue to a very different cultural environment. I'd say it would be hard to deny there was that kind of thing later on in the medieval period, that, you know, witch hunts and things like that. But in an Anglo-Saxon context, I don't know. If the aim of the church was on the one hand to discourage pre-Christian activities, and on the other hand to devalue women in their communities, then if you're decrying women for doing something that everybody does just for the sake of targeting women, I think you'd pick something you weren't that bothered about men doing, because by targeting women doing it, you're sort of giving men a pass to carry on doing it. At least that seems to make sense to me, but then that thought comes from my modern perspective, and so that's not necessarily something that would have been intuitive back then, so I might be very wrong. And the Anglo Saxon church was fairly egalitarian in terms of its organisation. Women held significant roles right from the beginning. There's a very good book by Christine Feld, I'll also link in the description. But I don't know, there'll be people watching this that know more about it than me. I know my friend Danielle's very knowledgeable about witchcraft in the medieval, post-medieval period, as is one of my lecturers, and they'll have a fuller understanding of it than I do. And it'd be fascinating to hear if there's anything important I've missed from anyone who knows more about it in the comments. I would suggest that the definition of a witch went beyond just someone who did medicine using words, because there's a number of Old English descriptive terms for specifically women that were able to do magical things, and I think those things may have extended beyond medicine. Where exactly they would have extended, I'm not quite equipped to say. If I were to base a kind of guess on later folklore, I might say something like divining the future, or being able to tell when people are going to die, or being able to perhaps communicate a little bit with dead people, or something like that. Maybe being more in tune with nature, but again, that's wild assumptions, that's wild guesses coming from my understanding of later folklore, which might have nothing to do with it. The interesting question to me is, however you see it, Christian authorities were trying to discourage what they saw as witchcraft, whatever their motive for that might have been. So can witchcraft just be seen as a catch-all term for, weird pagan stuff, or did it have a deeper historical meaning? So would a pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon have recognised the idea of a witch in the same way as a Christian Anglo-Saxon would? Would the word witch have had any of its negative connotations before Christianity? The etymology of these kinds of words can sometimes give us some idea, and luckily we do have cognates in other Germanic languages. We have a verb form, viken, in modern Low Saxon, and the fact that this doesn't show palatalisation on the k tells us that it's an old form. It's not just been borrowed from English or vice versa. And it means to practice witchcraft. And somebody that does this, or somebody that divines the future and things like that, can be called a vicar, which has absolutely no connection at all to the Christian figure of a vicar. With such scant evidence, it's hard to reconstruct a Proto-Germanic form confidently. There are a number of plausible ways you could explain the cognates we have, but all of them are kind of just so stories. So a noun like wikios would make sense, but bear in mind this is Proto-Germanic. This is a word that would have been used by pre-Christian people to describe witches, whatever they considered those to be. I think the common Germanic idea was of a person, not necessarily a woman, that had capabilities and intuitions that other people did not have. So they might have specialised in medicine, they might have been able to tell a certain amount about the future. And I wouldn't be surprised if the idea survives to us in folklore in two divergent ways. Firstly, in the idea of cunning men and women, and people that can sort of see the future, tell a certain amount about the future, maybe something to do with chimed children and things like that. If there's any connection at all, I think this is probably the most genuine continuation of the original idea of a witch. And then you have, on the other hand, the stereotypical idea of a witch as a decrepit old woman that flies around on a broomstick and eats children and things like that. And I think this is very likely to be more of a sort of Christian malforming of the original concept to discourage witchy practices. Thank you very much indeed for watching this video, and I will see you again soon.